Good evening. Happy to see many people who join us for today's event, despite the sun and the weather is much better as it was in the previous days. And we're incredibly happy that we are able to organize this event and this discussion together with Oля Tsepekova, which I will invite from organization which we admire a lot for all your work and the very amazing management of any kind of the events. So without any other explanation, I'm inviting Oля Tsepekova, head of North Azovian Greeks NGO.
Dear partners, dear friends, dear guests, you know, it's a very rare occasion when I'm reading the speeches I'm given, but today I decided to read, to print it out, just because of the sense of very high responsibility I have for this day. My name is Olga, and on behalf of North Azovian Greeks NGO, of course, my first warm and cordial gratitude goes to Pilecki Institute for hosting us today and welcome all of us in this important discussion. And I use this word important not because I would love to use cliché words, you know, but because this initiative is supposed to give voices for the generations of our ancestors, the North Azovian Greeks, and autochthonous people of Ukraine, whose history is deeply rooted in Crimea and whose home for nearly 250 years has been on the northern shores of the Sea of Azov, in the south of Donetsk Oblast of Ukraine. And when I say it with a very heavy heart, as I'm talking of my native land as well. Those homes of us, of North Azovian Greeks, all 76 settlements in Donetsk Oblast, is currently occupied by Russian Federation. Today, our distinguished panelists, our historians, and our moderator, dear Sarah Reinke, will speak about one of the darkest chapters in the history of North Azovian Greeks, the NKVD Greek Operation of 1937-1938. Urums and Roumeans, the two linguistic groups that together comprise the community of North Azovian Greek people, experienced these repressions not as abstract memories, not as an abstract process, but as a deeply personal trauma that also shaped generations of North Azovian Greeks. Thus, I hope today's discussion will help you to uncover yet another dimension of the totalitarian crimes committed in the late 1930s, while also offering insight into how the present-day identity of one of the most unique communities was formed. Together with my colleagues at the NGO, we work day after day to preserve our two languages, to preserve our culture, our history, and our identity. And our people often say, there is no North Azovian Greek family that was untouched by the events of NKVD Greek Operation. And families of our organization members are not exception to this. Standing here today, I remember members of my Roumean family, Ivan Kanana and Alexander Halangot, uncles of my great-grandmother, who were executed during the terror of Stalin regime. Among the co-founders of our NGO is Yuri Hala, the grandson of the repressed Roumean poet Vasil Hala, as well as Tatiana, the niece of Ilya Konop, director of the Mariupol Greek vocational school, pedagogical vocational school, once a symbol of this hope for cultural revival and renaissance among the North Azovian Greeks. The pop-up exhibition that you might have had the chance already to explore in the entry area of Pilecki Institute today was created with the support of dozens of families of our members and volunteers and supporters, including the families of Kazakh, Filachtov, Aslanov, Mitko, Miltych, Khadjinov, and Takhtamirov families who shared photographs from their family or personal archives. This exhibition we called Justice in Memory, a fragile space of remembrance. It brings together family portraits of North Azovian Greeks, photographs of those whose lives unfolded during the 1930s. They were the witnesses of this epoch, as well as portraits of the prominent members of the community that were created with the help of the talented Ukrainian artist Anatoly Belov. You will see some photographs that appear only as silhouettes or some outlines. You will not see the faces there, and there is a reason why. Because they also represent the images that we are losing now because of this war, as most of them remain inaccessible in territories occupied by the Russian Federation. Since the beginning of Russian aggression in 2014, and especially after the full-scale invasion start in 2022, tens of thousands of North Azovian Greeks have been forced to leave their homes, often without the possibility of saving even the most valuable family belongings, including old photographs and archives. In this way, the memory of 20th century repressions acquires a new dimension today through displacement, destruction, and loss caused by the ongoing war. Somehow it's all connected. The exhibition space itself is intentionally fragile and unstable. The uneven floor and the warning sign at the entrance, "Enter at your own risk," are not meant to distance you, the visitors, but rather they remind us that this space requires responsibility, sensitivity, and attentiveness. I would like to conclude my speech with a personal reflection. Authoritarian regimes of the past and present are deeply afraid of at least two things in my mind. Those are knowledge and memory. That is why they persecute intellectuals, they erase archives, they destroy cultural heritage, they occupy territories and attempt to silence entire communities. The struggle against these regimes is therefore also a struggle for remembrance. Today, by gathering here, by participating in this discussion, by looking at the old photographs, we symbolically restore a space for those who were denied the right to speak for themselves for generations. And perhaps this is where justice begins. Justice in memory. Thank you very much. And yes, now my pleasure would be to give the floor to our distinguished panel and the moderator, Sarah Reinke from the Society of Certain Peoples, our partner and friend. Sarah would introduce our panelists as well, and thus we would begin. But Sarah, if you need help in introduction, I would gladly help you as well. Okay, sure, it's fine. Now it's my pleasure to present you these three Ukrainian historians, people who made their way all the way from Kyiv. They actually had to start their route immediately the following day after the last massive attack of Russia on Kyiv. And thus, I'm more than happy to present you here Ms. Larysa Yakubova, professor, doctor of historical sciences, and head of Department of History of 1920s, 1930s at the Institute of History of National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Larysa, it's a pleasure to have you here. We also have here with us Mr. Valerii Tomazov, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Head of Sector at the Institute of History, also at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Mr. Valerii has been studying various Greek communities in Ukraine for decades now, and of course, for us it's a big honor he joined us today for the discussion. And last but definitely not the least, we have here today Anna Hedo, who is a Doctor of Historical Sciences professor at Kiev Metropolitan Boris Grinchenko University. She's head of Department of Ukrainian History, but also she's a North Azovian Greek. And thus, we are very happy and proud to have her among the panel participants. Thank you so much, Anna. And Yeva?
Yes, very short. Thank you, first of all, for sharing. And I think it's very important because, like, we don't have a privilege to speak on the history with a distance, not involving, like, the real events happening. And thank you for lighting up this once again. And for this particular reason, also director of Pilecki-Institut, Hania Radziowska, would like also to share some her input speech, but she will join us shortly. And you see the lights are saying that we can start with the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, Olja. My name is Sarah Reinke. I'm from the Society for Threatened Peoples in German, Gesellschaft für bedrohte Völker. And it's a great honor for me that you asked me to moderate this panel. I'm very happy that, that we are working together, that we are partners, that we are friends. And so let me start quickly because I'm also monitoring, of course, our time. And for our distinguished audience, I wish to say that there will be a Q&A, question-answer session after our panel discussion. So when questions come up to your mind, please sort of hold them in your mind and ask them later on. My first question goes to Valerii Tomazov. Could you introduce us to the topic of our today's event with the question, very fundamental question, who are these North Azovian Greeks who we are talking about today?
I am very glad to welcome, to see all of you, and I would like to start our discussion about North Azovian Greeks from the history on Ukrainian territories of Greeks. In fact, Greeks started to appear on Ukrainian lands many centuries ago. Can you hear me? Okay. Greeks begin to appear on Ukrainian territories many centuries ago. First settlements are registered in 7th age before our era, before Christ. It's the period of great colonization. It's the time when Greeks for the first time stepped on the territories of contemporary Ukrainian land. And during many centuries, this settlement never ceased. It had a different character. It could be singular resettlement. This could be the moves of the whole groups from territory of Greece, but not only from Greece, but also from territories where Greeks already lived. Those were places of Asia Minor and islands from which Greeks constantly moved to Ukrainian territory. These territories were different. When we speak about Greeks of Ukraine, we know those are areas where minorities live, like in many other countries in Europe. In Ukraine, Greeks always lived in compact settlements on certain territories, preserving their culture and peculiarity during many centuries. They had an opportunity to keep their national identity. In 2001 was done the last population census, and the indicators were established about Greek population in Ukraine. 0.2% of Greeks were of total population of Ukraine. It was around 92,000 of persons who lived in Ukraine. Among them, 57.5 thousand lived, 77.5 thousand lived in the area of North Azov. This was ethnic group in Ukraine. It was 85% of altogether number of Greeks in Ukraine. And a bit later I will explain that those are different ethnic groups. During the whole history of existence, Greeks created enormous amount of settlements in different parts of the country. Most known are Anizhinsky Greeks of Nizhin. You can see on the pictures of the objects that now exist in Nizhin. Greeks of Nizhin appeared there during Bogdan Khmelnytsky time. They were supposed to fulfill the function of supporting economical development and economy, as well trade during Cossacks' revolution. The settlement stayed there for more than 200 years. Greeks received huge number of rights. They had their own court, their schools, their hospital, markets, and so on. And until now, in Nizhin, there are remains of architecture, the construction erected during the Greeks' presence in Nizhin. Russian authorities destroyed Nizhin community. Greeks of Nizhin were deprived of their rights, and they were forced to move to other parts of Ukraine. Another big community was Greeks of Kiev. Greeks in Kiev started to come in 17th century. Usually those are merchants. On Podol, there were Greeks markets where Greek goods were brought there. And here you can see pictures of Orthodox churches that were erected by Greeks. Those are Greek Orthodox churches. On the right, you can see a small building that belonged to a Greek person who was a voit of Kiev. Voit is a municipal authority, a head of authority in the town. In fact, in Kiev, there were few Greeks who ruled that town, and in the end of 18th century, there was a head, Ivan Toli, of Greek origin. Also, famous activist of Greek revolutions, representatives who lived and died in Kiev. Greeks of Lviv, another big group of Greeks who lived in Ukraine. They also were mostly involved in trade, but they were also supporters of Orthodox Church and Orthodox mission in Lviv. They supported Orthodox Church there, as opposed to other Christian beliefs. Greeks of Odessa, another group. Ethnic settlement of Greeks in Odessa is also famous. You can see on the pictures a picture of Greek merchant who lived in Odessa, and photographs of Orthodox churches and other buildings, institutes that were built, founded by Odessa merchants in Odessa. And now we are coming directly to our heroes, North Azovian or Mariupol, Greeks of Mariupol. In fact, this ethnic group was formed in Crimea. They are not directly a Greek minority. This is autochthonic population of Crimea during Byzantine Empire. Their language and their minority formed. It is represented by two groups, Urums and Roumeans. As translated from Greek, word to word, it means Byzantium, and Urums also is translated as Byzantinians. Urumian language was formed before new Neo-Greek one that is now used in Greece. they had related to a Greek contemporary culture, but it is an original culture. Now, how they moved to North Azovian steppes. The history is such in year 87 there was a forced resettlement of North Azovian Greeks together with other Christians from Crimea. Catherina II wanted to use Crimea for herself, and that was the way to weaken Crimea Khanate, since the Greeks was an important part in development of the trade. They were involved in horticulture, agriculture. They were a very important part of Crimean economy. So when they were forcefully moved out, economy of Crimea Khanate began collapsing, and in such way, Crimea was an easy prey for Russian authority. They occupied Crimea totally in few next years, and on the other side, it was suitable for Russian Empire, since at that time North Azovian territories from Nahai were emptied, and these territories needed to be resettled. The agriculture was supposed to be developed, and North Azovians were used to populate and to work with economical development of newly occupied regions of Russian Empire, starting with their traditions and so on. It was really difficult for Greeks to adopt into these new economic and natural conditions, since they were completely different to the conditions that existed in Crimea. During the resettlement, 31,000 of Christians, 18,000 of them were Greeks. 4,000 Greeks died during this resettlement. Since the resettlement was poorly organized, Greeks didn't want to go, but they were escorted by military units from Russian Empire, and they were forcefully resettled. Here you can see a portrait of that person. It is a Goth and Kafka metropolite, Ignatiy Gazadimov, who became a leader of that resettlement. Russians found him by purpose because he was the man in whom they seen their hopes. He received gratitude of Russian Empire for summoning Greeks for this resettlement.
And in the middle, when you can see the diploma that was given to North Azovian Greeks in 1789, that was guaranteeing them certain privileges and granting them certain rights on the new territories. There is a very sad history for that document. It was kept in the Mariupol Museum, but we do not know where the original document is these days, because Mariupol was destroyed by the current occupying force. We know that the museum was destroyed and plundered. Therefore, currently, we do not know where the document is, and we do not know whether this document has been preserved or maybe it has already been taken to the territory of Russia. We know nothing of the fate of this document. What you see now is other photographs of North Azovian Greeks from many different villages. You can see here some traditional attire. To the right there, you can see a man and a woman who are wearing traditional attire of the Azovian Greeks, and next to them you can see some jewelry that was used by the women on wedding days. So those are traditional costumes, but also ornaments and jewelry that were used by Urums and Roumeans. In data, we need to take into consideration that because despite of very difficult conditions, they have been able to preserve their languages and traditions. So I do hope that I have given a brief answer to your question. You asked me to introduce you to the North Azovian Greeks, so I have just outlined a brief history of these peoples. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valerii. And we are dealing with the Soviet period today or this evening. So I would like to ask Larysa Yakubova. We already have the slide about colonization or indigenization. In the 1920s, we speak about these politics and also the hopes for the Urums and Roumeans connected with national and cultural revival. Could you please elaborate a bit about the development of this, of these policies and give us the background of the politics of colonization? Thank you.
Вітаю, товариство.
Dear colleagues, good afternoon. The colonization policy is one of the most interesting periods in the history of Ukraine, although I should admit that all historic periods are very interesting. And the history of the Greek community is a kind of a matryoshka. It's like a toy where you have many different peoples. Stereotypically, they're considered to be just one people, but that is not true. That is not correct. In the 1970s, if we look at the modern territory of Ukraine, it was a part of the Russian Empire, and this is where the social explosion or upheaval took place. And if we look into the historiography in the West, they usually think that that was the Russian Revolution. But in fact, it was quite a complex phenomenon. There was also a Ukrainian revolution, and not many people realized there was one. It's not really well known abroad, and in the Russian historiography, they never mention about the Ukrainian revolution. But there were several revolutions in the territory of Ukraine. In 1917, of course, there was the Russian Revolution in Moscow and Petrograd, but in Kiev, there was the Ukrainian Revolution, and the Ukrainian Revolution was striving to it was developing very fast, faster than in Russia, because Ukraine was the battlefield and many combat operations were taking place in the territory of Ukraine. So the Russians started developing a fiction. And between 1914 and 1917, these territories that were populated by the Greek peoples, and actually there were many Greek communities also in Turkey and in the Mediterranean. And we know that Greeks were moving to the today's Ukrainian territories, but also Greeks from Anatolia and Turkey. They were the refugees from Anatolia and Turkey, and so they replenished the Greek communities in Ukraine, and they were also subjected to the policy of colonization. Now, 1917, Spring Revolution started, and initially there was a process of autonomization of Ukraine, and then the process of developing sovereignty of Ukraine. It's hard to believe, but in Mariupol, Greeks were already very active. They were very active citizens of new society, because in 1917, after the nominal Russian Revolution, they received the citizens' rights. And therefore, like elsewhere in the territory of the former empire, they started their preparations for the establishment of councils or assemblies. And so they were very active citizens. They also constituted a 13th district to take part in the elections. And this is when the Mariupol community of Greeks presented themselves, demonstrated themselves to be very active citizens. They took part in that assembly. They were capable of nominating their own candidates. But then the Bolsheviks, after the coup d'etat and after their revolution, it was actually It was anti-constitutional coup d'etat. The Bolsheviks disbanded the assembly, and therefore the Greeks in Mariupol were left without their own representatives, just like all other ethnic communities in Ukraine, that at that time was a sovereign state. It was a newly born Russian state, because it appeared almost at the same time as Ukrainian statehood. Of course, the Russians are saying that it was just one state, but in fact, there were two states. There was Ukraine and Russia was also born as a country in 1917. Anyway, the Greeks were left without their own representatives in the assembly, but they didn't stay quiet, and the Mariupol community of Greeks were very politically active. They wanted to have their own representatives. They wanted to be duly represented because, of course, those days there was this, everyone wanted to have the Hellenic policy. Everyone wanted democracy, which is the Hellenic policy. Everyone wanted to develop in a civilized way. And then when the North Azovian territories were occupied by the White Army, then by the German army, by the Austrian army, the Greeks didn't go just to vote. The Greeks went to the Makhnov's military units. So Greeks became very active, not only politically. They joined the Makhno troops. So we've all known, we've all heard about Makhno. So they joined the Makhno in the development of an anarchic republic in those territories. And of course, the relations with the future Soviet, with the Soviet authorities and with the Bolsheviks were very complex at the time. Well, it's not enough to say that their relations were complicated. They were enemies. The Makhno movement was the enemy of the Bolshevik movement. In 1921, when for the third time Bolsheviks entered the territory of Ukraine, and the Bolsheviks then started developing the new narrative of Ukraine being a Soviet Ukraine. And this is because, in fact, there was a lot of fighting between 1972 and 1921, but then the last narrative was approved in 1921 by the Bolsheviks. So Bolsheviks started thinking, what would they do with the Greeks, with the North Azovian Greeks? Of course, not only the Greeks were the enemies of Bolsheviks, there were also Germans there, and there were many other peoples populating the North Azovian area. Ethnically speaking, there was ethnic polyphony in the North Azovian lands at that time. There were many other ethnic groups as well, but that's a separate topic. Anyway, so, of course, those relations with the Bolsheviks were very complex because now the new Soviet authorities appeared, a new Soviet Ukraine was established. And so they thought, okay, we will give factories to the workers and the land will be given to the farmers. But that was a blatant lie because, in fact, they took the land away from the farmers. And as for the North Azovian Greeks, they were the farmers. They used to have much more land than Ukrainian farmers used to have. The North Azovian Greeks were using those lands as their community lands. So, in fact, they were using those lands starting from the times of Catherine the Great. There was no private ownership at the time. So, all of a sudden, the Bolsheviks come, and the Bolsheviks started taking those lands away from the North Azovian Greeks. So they started distributing those land parcels to other farmers. So the Greeks and the Germans ended up in a situation when, again, they had to fight against the Soviet authorities, and they were fighting actively until 1923. And but for the famine, there would probably have been the Second Civil War. Anyway, it is in that period of time when the Bolsheviks started rethinking their policy about Ukraine, what to do about Ukraine, because they wanted to install not only the Greeks who didn't want the Bolsheviks or the Soviet authorities, the Germans didn't want to have the Bolsheviks authority. Everyone was against the Bolsheviks, the Germans, the Jews, the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Greeks, and the Bulgarians. No one wanted the Bolsheviks to be there. And 1921, well, first in 1917, the Greeks were already there, and the Greeks established the All-Russia Union of Hellenic Peoples. So that association was actually had been created before the assembly. And for instance, they wanted to establish the autonomous Mariupol district. So you see, there was always this thought of establishing a Greek autonomy, but it was taken away from them. The Greeks used to have their own political plan, but that plan was taken away from them. In 1921, they understood that you couldn't do anything with the Bolshevik authorities because the Bolshevik authority had their own ideas. So the Greeks started thinking, okay, what needs to be done so as to revive, so as to survive? So they created different initiate groups. They started traveling around villages and they started drafting lists of those who wanted to resettle. And the Bolsheviks started collecting signatures, 100,000 people to be resettled together with the Greeks who were not actually Greeks. Anyway, many people wanted to leave the Soviet Union, just to go away. What stopped them was Greece, because Greece refused to accept so many migrants. And then the Soviet Union blocked them from leaving this territory. So this is what was happening at that time. People wanted to leave, but they simply could not. And the same was happening to some other groups. And then there was this Lenin, and Lenin wanted to create a certain system that would force all of the ethnic groups to become one single group. And that's why Bolsheviks decided to launch the Koreanization policy. What the Bolsheviks wanted to do, they wanted to create an illusion of the people's power. Power was given as if to the people so that the people could live and revive and could nourish their culture. That was one of the mottos of the revolution. And at that time, everyone was saying, just give us our chance to be ourselves. We don't want to be Russians. We're not Russians. We simply want to be ourselves. Ukrainians wanted to be Ukrainians. Greeks wanted to be Greeks. The Poles wanted to be the Poles. The Jews wanted to be the Jews. And that's it. So that was Ukrainian Revolution. That was what Ukrainian Revolution was about. Anyway, in 1923, there was this famous Congress of the Bolsheviks in Moscow, and they approved the Lenin's policy of Koreanization. In fact, had the Ukrainians, national communists, not been there, that policy would not have been adopted. Anyway, in 1923, they decided to change their policy in a radical way. On the 1st of August, they passed a law on the equality of languages. And the Soviet Ukraine at that time became a country where theoretically national minorities' languages were treated on an equal footing with the state and official language. So of course, Russian was the Franco lingua, the lingua franca, and it was the language that started dominating that space. And that is the territory that later on became the Soviet Union. But at that time, it was not yet the Soviet Union as we knew it. But what was happening inside those republics? The so-called Koreanization process was unleashed. And Greeks, just like other national minorities, were having hopes. They wanted to self-deceive themselves. They thought that colonization would help them to revive after 10 years of wars and famine. We simply wanted to live normal lives. The Greeks were promised that they would have their own national and administrative institutions, that they will have their own councils and village councils and district councils. They were promised that they will be able to run their own business, that they would be capable of setting up schools, that they will be able to run their cultural centers, and so on and so forth.
And keep choosing their own lives. They believed in all that. These people that you just saw and these children here, those are effect of the policy. However, the policy was a lie, because what they understood as self-government, like resettlement by Catherine the Great into Mariupol region of empire, they found themselves in other empire when theoretically, they lived in national regions, in national districts. They supposedly could live their lives, but it was not a national life, but Soviet life. And first awful thing that happened to them, here on the previous picture, Valerii, famous person from the community, an architect of a Greeks and Urumizations policy. That's how it is called, the Koreanization policy or indigenization, actually being an architect of that policy. He was a part of state institution that was called a Central Committee on Local Minorities, developed the policy in Ukraine of indigenization in all ethnical groups. It was the representative from Greeks in year 25. He introduced a program that was never introduced by ethnical communities before. He, in fact, went to CKNM, so that's how this institution was called, next to the Soviet government, as a person who came with a ready program. His lecture on archive can be found, case number 100, is more than 80 pages, where he, together with local Greeks who were interested in development of the program, presented all the features of the communities, language, culture, locations. Such details were not available to any other ethnical communities. And with time, until year 1930, when he was released, at that time he still was in the committee, he made a tremendous scope of work, but just like Greeks fooled him, misled him. And moreover, at first he fought first with Makhno and then with Soviet army, and he joined the committee as former commissar of the Red Army, so he believed in all that. But he clearly understood the distinctions of his community, the difference of his community from what was understood as Greeks. He clearly said in year 1925, languages are very different. He clearly presented materials where it was stated Greeks, parents of Greek children, on the meetings protest against teaching in Greek language because they didn't understood that language. Not only Urums, but
Але як комуніста вже в 26-му році після всесоюзного совіщання про
Romanians as well. But when the cultural work among the Greeks by the committee was done, he was broken, and he began to break the community. It was accepted on an all-Soviet level, a decision that the language of Ukrainian Greeks of all these communities can be only a revolutionary language that wasn't present yet in Greece. The language that existed only as a literature language that will become in 1970s a state language of Greeks. But in Soviet community of Greeks, they were supposed to be first on the planet, perhaps die, but to fulfill this Bolsheviks' illusion. During that time, by the efforts of Sava Yali, 3 national regions were created in year 27 to the anniversary of resettlement of Greeks from Crimea, because there was supposed to be a political action, an event that would be broadly presented widely in USSR, but also in Greece. You can see oppressors of Greek proletariat. Look how the questions are solved in Soviet Union. We have 3 national regions. They never said that people in these regions never spoke the languages, but they formally existed. The schools were created, but neither teachers nor children would not use the language. But in the reports, there was supposed to be a Greek language and none other. That was the policy of the party. And of course, Soviet elections, Soviet Greeks were put in lines, and once in a year they were supposed to go there and choose the representatives of authorities. And only communists could be in the list of that authorities. And around 40% of inhabitants in villages were not allowed to vote. They didn't have the voting right. They got into the situation where they supposedly had national regions. Everything could happen in a cultural and civic life of the community in their language, but it was only a Soviet illusion. And the level of the oppression and the lies, they understood only when overall collectivization began.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think you can just continue. You're taking us through the steps now of Soviet history in this aspect, and with focus on the Urums and Roumeans.
Я вітаю всіх присутніх. І хочу звернутися
I
до вас.
welcome all present here today. I want to address you first of all with the message that today I want to tell about North Azovian Greeks, not a historian that spent 30 years to learn their history, who has a degree and published monographies. I want to speak in the name of North Azovian Greeks. My mother, she comes from Malyanisol village, and I lived in that village until getting to Donetsk National University. I understood that the life in the community is inside my scientific interest, and working in archives, in old yellow papers of different cases, I heard always not statistics, not accusations, but the voice of these Greeks. And today I want to give word to these Greeks, how they perceived these terrible events. Because North Azovian Greeks were forcefully saved by Russia so many times. First, they were forcibly resettled. Then they will go through collectivization, Holodomor, repressions, and today they are unfortunately occupied, again saved by Russians. They are occupied. Now let's go back to the collectivization. Madame Larysa said about main elements of the construction of Soviet times. I want to go back on how Greeks took collectivization and what was their farms and lands looked like before the collectivization. It had a very low productivity. At that time, the productivity of their lands was very low, very small production of cattle, only 14 cows per 100 persons. So it was already a very hard agricultural work to provide for themselves, but authorities saw it differently, and they seen it differently. For them, the rich, wealthy state of Greeks was a threat. The question was how a poor people could live with all the agricultural equipment. Even during harvesting, a person could be announced to be a kurkulus, a kurkul, because for general wealthy of Greeks actually became their death sentence. What were the mechanisms of the destruction of agricultural, Greek agricultural? Those were concentration camps, resettlement north, and with confiscation of property and resettling to worse lands if they stayed inside the region. When they started to bring my co-villagers behind Ural, smart and hardworking Greeks couldn't understand this injustice. We only were left to think one thing: we were punished because we were Greeks. Here I want to add a remark that indeed they think that, but they were punished not only because they were Greeks, but because they were Ukrainian Greeks. And the events of genocide will show that. How Greeks treated actions of the authority, here I want to pay an attention that authorities indeed acted like occupying army. Communists approached the building, they took everything. All kinds of products, beans, rye, crops. They torn away floor, they checked all premises and took away everything. Or another recall, they took everything and we were afraid and we gave away everything. About the systematic nature of the crime, just by an example of one region, for not fulfilling the definitely excessive plan of bread preparation. Only in one region they punished 5 leaders of collective farms in the full composition. That would be around 600 persons that were punished. 20 persons were sentenced to death by shooting. Others received different periods of detention from 5 to 10 years. Another terrible story of North Azovian Greeks are blackboards. Blackboards are a product of Soviet authorities that was applied against Ukrainians. They didn't steer out also Greek villages. What are blackboards? In a village, for not providing the norms of bread production, were encircled by armed units. Everyone could go out. No one could get into that village, and then no one could get out of that village.
Thus, people were dying. And as for the blackboards, they were listing, for instance, such farms as the Novosela in the Novokaransky Village Council, or the another farms Heat in the Greco-Alexandrivka Village Council, but also there was a village of Gurzov that is in the Mariupol district. Now, what do the Greeks say? After our village was put on that list, they stopped selling us even matches. The guards were standing on all the roads, and they would not let anyone, neither to us nor out from our villages. We were imprisoned, but the prison was without the walls. I just would like to say that Given this situation and given the operations of the Soviet authorities, of course, the diplomatic corps paid attention, and Spiros Paryanis, the ambassador of Greece to Moscow in 1933, in August, he reported to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Greece. He reported on the number of Greeks being sentenced by the courts, and he mentioned that the Greeks were being resettled, and that was being done because they were Greeks. And now the next slide, please. Here I would like to quote yet another person. He was the one who was running that policy. He was the one enforcing the Soviet policy in Greek villages and in Greek regions. Namely, he was Ivan Stryonov. Larysa published his own memoirs, and one could think he was actually a leader. He was the one representing the Kremlin, and one could think, okay, he is a representative of authorities. How would he react to such activities? Of course, he would approve of them, but in his memoirs, and by the way, I fully agree with Larysa, those are the memoirs of a communist building communism, but this is his real point of view. It's a point of view of a real person. And what he says is the following. He is a member of the authorities. Collective farm workers, having left their last scraps behind, went to the towns to rescue themselves from starvation. Many of them died on the roads, not reaching the towns. They were eating dry scraps of bread, and right there, not far from that same place, they were falling and dying. What was the death ratio? I mean, you can't describe it in any way else. What were they eating? They were eating lamb's quarters, pigweed roots, ground squirrels, and leather belts. Therefore, biological survival was bordering with poisoning. And again, we need to think. There was a lot of self-sacrifices. Parents were doing their best to save their children, and children were doing their best to save the parents. Our uncle, he cooked a ground squirrel. He himself drank just the water, and then he gave us the meat, and he said, "It doesn't matter for me anyway. My end is near. You are young. You live." One more issue that I would like to talk about is breaking our customs, that is the destruction of our dignity. For the Greeks, it is very important to have the proper burial. We bury people with dignity. And this is part of our Greek mentality, to arrange proper, dignified burial. But this traditional culture of burial was destroyed during the time of famine. The bodies became waste. Now, let's read what the Greeks were saying. Before his death, my father asked, "I don't want you to pull me on a sledge like a dead horse at the dump. Tear up the floorboards in the room and make a grave there." His daughter did that. She followed his bidding. This is what they did. They took the floorboards, they made a coffin, and then the neighbor came, and she also asked to take her own mother to the cemetery. And her daughter says, "When I was approaching the cemetery, I fainted." She said, because my father's grave was filled with dead bodies to the brim. What was the result of that? That was the policy of collectivization. That was the policy of famine. Well, the result was that the Ukrainian and Greek countryside was destroyed. It was destroyed both physically and mentally. There was total fear. We were constantly afraid of everything. No one would share anything with anyone else, and to save themselves, many Greeks were trying to move out, to go to the cities so as to survive. And as Ivan Alexeyenko, a Greek, he was saying rural life was finished, and the wisdom of our ancestors was forlorn.
Thank you so much, Anna. Now we come to another escalation of oppression, the so-called NKVD Operation against the Greek minority or North Azovian Greek minority. Larysa, would you take us through this operation, please? And we have to watch the time a little bit.
Okay, я швиденько.
Yeah, so I'll be very quick. Well, to say quick on that topic, well, it's very difficult to talk speedily about this topic because this is a very profound topic, and many times people do not realize, do not understand what the Soviet Union was, what the Soviet power was, what they were doing, not only to Greeks. Naive people were thinking that only they were being destroyed, but that was a global catastrophe. The Soviet authority was isolating ethnic groups, various ethnic groups, and as if they were doing for the best and for the good of those ethnic communities in their compact settlements. But in fact, all of these groups were spread out in different quarters, but this is how the Soviet authorities were killing the intelligence. They were destroying everyone. So in the Soviet Ukraine, this Soviet authority was sapping life out of all ethnic groups. All ethnic groups suffered. Even Ukrainian Russians suffered. And in fact, there were so many Ukrainian Russians as well in Ukraine. But believe me, all Russians also suffered, and 7 Russian regions were neighboring with Greek regions in the Donbas area. But the Russians also suffered. The Ukrainian Russians suffered also. So all national groups, all farmers, regardless of their ethnic origin, all of them, during the collectivization, were forced to stay in real communes where they were dying. And exactly, they were creating communes designed by communists. What is a commune? Commune means that you have nothing that belongs to you. People do not have even their own underwear. You, as an individual, you're no one. You are a part of a collective. You are there to work day and night, 24/7, and you are fed with whatever is left. And this is what was happening to the Germans, to the Greeks, to the Russians, to Ukrainians, and all ethnic groups were placed in those Soviet ghettos. And the name for that ghetto was the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So at that time, at the time of famine, that was in 1932 and 1933, many people thought that that was the most horrible thing. It couldn't be any worse than that. People thought it couldn't get any worse. But in fact, there was this constant escalation. It was constantly getting worse. You asked about the Great Terror, but that was not the only single episode of terror. The terror didn't stop in 1921. The terror was being exercised against the Soviet citizens and Greeks. But in 1937, the situation was led to the logical end by the Kremlin. In February, the Communist Party, decided to pass a new Soviet constitution. In the new Soviet constitution, the former fractions were devoid of any rights. They were not allowed to take part in elections anymore. So all of the former political groups ceased to exist. And so the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Bolsheviks, they got together and they thought, okay, that was the 20th anniversary of the so-called Great October Soviet Socialist Revolution, and that it would happen in November 1937. They decided that by that time, the Soviet Union and the Soviet Ukraine will have to be freed from the anti-Soviet elements. So they sat down and thought, how would they do that? So in April, they developed a plan of repressions to be enforced all over the space of the territory of the Soviet Union, so as to, as they say, liberate the Soviet Union from the anti-communist elements and anti-Soviet elements. So they developed a plan, they designed a plan, and then plan meant the beginnings of the Gulag system. This is how, in huge pace, very quickly, they started developing special camps. The camps where in the future people would be kept that would be resettled from other parts of the Soviet Union. There were entire brigades working hard on training how to arrest people, how to force people, how to keep those people in prisons. They were preparing prisons, and those prisons would be filled very soon with hundreds and hundreds of detainees. They were trained how to treat people badly, how to arrest people, how to take property away from people. They were trained in killing people. They were trained in mass executions. They were doing it very fast. In March, the Bolsheviks passed the so-called roadmap. So they already then established a special authority to run this operation. They started training the military personnel. They started training the NKVD brigades to do their job. Just think of the scale, because if you think of it, it's 300,000 people in Ukraine only. And over a span of a year and a half, 300,000 people had to be repressed. People would not go of their own free will to prisons. They had to be forced. Someone had to force them. They needed to be trained in that. So first in the beginning of May, they changed the authorities within the NKVD system. So as they were saying, they extracted the head of the Kiev NKVD, and he was sent to the Far East, and then he was executed. But Israeli Plevsky was moved to Kiev, and he started the enforcement or the implementation of that roadmap. In May, they decided, they made the list of places from which they would start the resettlement of the so-called anti-Soviet element. And so they started the implementation of that plan. The plan was called Create Free Spaces Within 2 months. And they started, as if they were saying, cleansing those territories, and they were started the persecution of the wealthy peasants and of intelligentsia. So, as they were saying, please, they were cleansing those territories, but they were cleansing those territories from the former, they were saying former peasants. So that was, they knew exactly what they were doing. They were repeating those operations so as to cleanse those territories. So they decided that the entire cities, but also the capital, will be cleansed of the wealthy peasants and of wealthy citizens. So they decided that they will also start the persecution of ethnic communities. And the first community to target, the first order, that was 00427. That was the order to remove the Germans. They started with the Germans. They started with the Ukrainian Germans, and they forced the Germans to move very quickly. They forced them to leave the territory over a period of nearly 2 weeks, just 2 weeks. Then the next persecution was the wave of persecutions against the Ukrainian Poles. That was in the beginning of August. So the Germans were persecuted in July, the Poles were persecuted in August. So the report went to the Kremlin that they became skillful and they gained some experience in the resettlement of the Ukrainian Germans and of the Ukrainian Poles. And the Poles, by the way, suffered the most in numerical sense. The most people who died were the Poles.
When they completed an algorithm of destruction of ethnic communities, and all they were destroyed because for the reason of creating national spying, anti-revolution, anti-Soviet, terrorist. I will tell you all the compound names. They went through national operations. Each of them had separate name. It would be 19 groups created by Ukrainian Germans, 19 terrorist, anti-revolutionary, anti-Soviet organizations. Each of them had separate name. And Ukrainian Greeks, after Ukrainian Bulgars, and after Ukrainian Jews, no matter, they usually went through political case, not national, like Trotskyists and others. In the end of November, that sacred month for all Soviet communists, when Soviet Union had to be cleaned already from this defiance, the order came to Greeks. You know that the day of remembering for Greeks, my community in Ukraine, is 15th of December, when massive cleansing began among groups of Ukrainian Greeks. And here, before Madam Anna tells more details about that, I will just say that at this moment, in the end of November, when everyone was celebrating a 20th anniversary of the victory of proletariat world revolution and the creation of this so-called state where proletarian revolution won, Greeks of all the communities in Ukraine were again combined artificially into one body that was called Greek National Operation. They were all repressed with the cases of so-called not existing, made up, brought from Kremlin, from the top, invented cases of national Greek anti-revolution, terrorist, insurrecting organizations. You all need to remember that forever, that at that time they never were nor insurrectors nor terrorists, and even not anti-Soviet, because in this operation they destroyed everyone, every honest local Greek communists and Soviet apparatus.
Anna will now zoom in and concentrate on the Greek operation against the Urums and Roumeans.
Наш час обмежений, тому я зупинюсь тільки на основних моментах.
Yes, we have a limited time, so I will focus on main elements of Greek operation. Like Madam Larysa said already, indeed, on 15th of December 1937 begins massive arrests of Greeks of all the republics. And during first 10 days, they arrested almost 6,000 persons of Greek origin, Greek nationality. All they were accused, of course, for spying, diversion actions, counter-revolutionary organizations. But what really happened is what Madam Larysa Pilecki already said. There is an order to arrest, and by any conditions, arrest in any number up to 5,000 people, regardless of the availability of compromising materials on them. In this way, they followed the plan. So arrests were carried out not because of something, but in order to fulfill the quota, so-called quota. Everyone understands, I hope, present here, how that happened. Very often it happened during night, so they only simply arrested people, and after the arrest, they found out about the existence of a Greek counter-revolutionary organization. They found out in the basement from the investigator. And what happened, of course, people did not confirm that when they heard that, a conveyor of interrogation began. First, there was a physical impact, so many times of standing position under a powerful lamp, beatings of different sorts with rubber truncheons, complete, absolute torture, then psychological terror, deprivation of sleep, threats to arrest family members, simulation of execution, and all that took place in a conveyor without an end. So one investigator changed to the other one, not giving a chance even to rest a bit to a victim. It was clear it was done only to get a confession. If a person refused, they were beaten until they fainted. When Greeks recalled that Mariupol prison in the summer of 1937 was overcrowded. Heat, stench, flies, we stood pressed tightly against one another. One fellow countryman advised me, "Petro, confess everything to the investigator immediately, otherwise you will not endure it." Next slide, please. Here you can see the absurdity of the accusations. So, more than 63% of members of espionage, sabotage, insurrections organizations, almost 20% for anti-Soviet agitation and participation in other counter-revolutionary organizations, propaganda of fascism and all other. Investigators framed the cases so quickly that there were paradoxes at some points. For example, accusing a person of participating in executions during the Civil War when they had been only, at that time, they had been only 12. But it was never an obstacle for the investigators, completely non-evidential basis that could incriminate, so none existed. As a result of the investigators' comedy of justice using moral and physical coercion, I signed a shameful fabricated statement, a protocol of my testimony about some counter-revolutionary activity against myself. All that was used, so the mechanism of death, the album method, and the troikas, so no investigation of such was done. On one page there was a biographical data of a person. It was stitched together into an album, it was signed, and these album lists are most tragic ones because 95% of those sentenced under the albums were shot to death. The repressions not only touched Greek men, but also their families. Sofia Tatenko. At the beginning, investigator Afanasiev was in charge of my husband's case. During one of those conversations, while looking down at the papers, he quietly said, "Tatenko, take the child and leave this place. You have nothing left to do here, and you will not need the apartment anymore." And she says, unfortunately, at the time, she did not understand the meaning of this advice. At that time, she understood when she found herself in Algiers in a specialized camp for members of the family of traitors to the motherland. From her memoirs, she says, instead of 5 years of the sentence, she spent there 8.5 years. The most terrifying statistics of the terror in Greek villages. You can see on the screen. Mali Yanisol arrested 109, executed 108. So the percentage of the executed by shooting was almost 100%. So most of them were shot down. According to official data, executed by firing squad was 3,479 Greeks, maybe more. And again, we can say about the destruction and disruption of burial traditions. These victims, these people, unfortunately don't have graves. The bodies were not given away to families. It was forbidden, and there was no grave. And the result of this great terror was the destruction of Greeks' intelligence, the elites. Only two last names of those who they destroyed. Konstantin Chalpai, main engineer who designed an engine for T-34 tank. He was tortured and forced to sign his confession about espionage, and he was shot down. The execution was covered from his family.
Данила. І Данило Теленчі, тобто актор, режисер
Danila Telenci,
Маріупольського
actor, director of Mariupol Theater, who was also accused to be an enemy of the state. Why? For Greek language, simply for Greek language. As a result, Greek theater was liquidated, school, editorial, and as a result of this operation, we can say that not only wealthy peasants were destroyed, but in fact all the intelligence and elite of Ukrainian Greeks. Literally 3 minutes to conclude. What was the point of that made-up Greek counter-revolutionary, anti-Soviet terrorist organization? The point was of incrimination in more or bigger degree from Soviet authorities to teachers, poets like Konstantin Kostoprav, Grigory Kostoprav, like the whole Mariupol theater, like state editor in Greek language in Mariupol was destroyed. Mariupol Greek Technical Institute. What was they accused of? Creating anti-Soviet organization with the purpose to restore Mariupol Greek circle, the one that was before the revolution, the one that's signatures were collected in 1917, the one that they dreamed to resettled in 1931, with the purpose to tear out from Soviet Union and to join to fascist fascist Greece. They worked for German Gestapo, investigative service, and fascist Greece. So they were accused that they wanted to create in the territory of Soviet Ukraine an independent Greek fascist republic, just like the same German settlers or Jewish settlers at that time wanted to create independent Zionist republic on the territory of Soviet Ukraine, and Poles created a reason to separate to Polish Pilsudski's Poland, and these bad Ukrainians, shameful Ukrainians, wanted to restore UNR. And all the cultural elite they destroyed because of that indigenization in all Soviet policy they enforced into Greeks. They were executed by firing squad for what they were forced to do by communist authority, because on this territory of Soviet Republic of Ukraine was forcing Mariupol Greeks to talk, to learn the not natural to them language, demotics, and by that to ruin the trust to Soviet authority.
And Also, the same was happening in Mariupol. The same happened to the Greek National Theatre. The National Greek Theatre, by the way, was being established for 7 years with great difficulties. And in fact, they were trying to unite the Greeks from the entire territory of the Soviet Ukraine. And all of them were shot down. All of them were executed so that no one of them would transfer the fear of the famine, because they had survived the famine. So they were silenced forever. So the Great Terror, it's not just about the physical extermination of people, it's the extermination of more than that. They exterminated the entire national territories that were no longer needed. So those national units, territorial units, were disbanded. They became Russian regions. So there was a Jewish region, and the Greek region was there, and there was a Russian region, and all of them were disbanded after these operations. And so the Bolsheviks passed yet another resolution. They said that the Russian language will become the language of instruction in the so-called no Russian schools. So, in fact, the album method of extermination was banned in 1938.
The Soviet Socialist Revolution, all the national regions of Ukraine and Greece were destroyed. All schools, national schools, were forgotten like terrible dream.
Thank you so much. Yeah, now you took us through this whole period with all these really tragic and horrible events. And please, you in our audience, take also the chance to check out the exhibition, because as you, Anna, really did present us with the individual cases, the stories of the families. And that is also the approach in the exhibition, so please take the chance to look at this. We have to take now a big step and come here today in the present situation. So I would like to ask you, why is it so important to know this history? Do you see any connections between the Soviet crimes nearly 90 years ago and the current war Russia is waging against Ukraine? And why, in the light of what we now heard, is it so important nowadays to understand and also position the North Azovian Greeks as an autochthonous people of Ukraine? Why do we need this, and how maybe also can we push forward this idea, and with the, of course, in keeping in mind to the protection of this unique people and of these two really unique languages? Valerii, do you want to start maybe? It's a question to all of you. And we have 15 more minutes. That's what Olya said, but let's try to aim 10 at maybe that we have now 10 minutes of of panel discussion and then some quick Q&A.
Could you please show the map? Please show the map. First, I would like to talk about the maps. Have a look. What you see, those are two maps. One of the maps shows the settlements and the villages where Greeks used to live. So this is the North Azovian territory. Now, have a look at another map. What you see is another map, and this is the map was generated by the Deep State app, and it shows the current occupation of Ukrainian territories. So have a look at these two maps. So all of the compact settlement territories where the North Azovian Greeks used to live are being occupied. So two processes are taking place at the same time. This is ethnocide and this is genocide happening at the same time, What is ethnocide? Ethnocide is the destruction of a people, as a group of people, as an ethnic group. So this is the destruction of their language, of their culture. And after that, a people simply disappears. It disappears from history. It is gone. But then we also yet another process taking place, that is the genocide. And the genocide means that representatives of a nation are being exterminated, physically exterminated, physical destruction. This is exactly what is happening to North Azovian Greeks right now. Why does it hurt so much? Why is it so important? Well, first, we're talking about the physical destruction of people. Those are people, living people, families that have been destroyed. Now, I am a researcher, and for me, it hurts a lot because they are destroying an entire ethnic group. In the beginning, I said that North Azovian Greeks are not a Greek diaspora. They are an autochthonous group. They have unique culture. They have unique languages. And if they're not supported, if now we do not support their languages, if now we do not preserve their cultures, it will be impossible to recreate those. So today we are at the juncture where we may lose the entire ethnic community from the history of the world in Europe. We may lose an ethnic group as it is, and then later we will not be in the position to recreate it. It will not be possible. Now, this is a result of a very long-standing Russian policy. They started their policy in the 18th century with the forceful resettlement of Greek populations. And we can see it through centuries. If you look at it, it's through the centuries and decades. The Russian policy was aimed at persecuting this ethnic group. It is being destroyed. This is the direct consequence of what is happening. We started with the settlement of Crimea, and we're looking at the today's condition. Therefore, we address communities, we address scientists, we also appeal to international organizations. Please address your attention to the current events. Do take note of what is happening right now. I would like to add just my final word. You see, the Mariupol Greeks, for me, and I'm a researcher of Mariupol Greeks, and all of my professional life I've been researching this community. Of course, I was running quite a number of other topics, and over a span of the previous 4 years I've been researching primarily neo-totalitarian challenge to the world that is posed by Russia. So, if we focus on the fate of this ethnic group, and they are a phenomenal group, they are phenomenon of global world culture, and what is happening to them is unbelievable, because this is an amazing people, and they have been able to survive in this region that has always been very much an active territory where there is so much ethnic interaction between many different groups, and still they have been able to maintain their identity back from the times of Roman and Byzantine culture. They have been able to preserve that culture. So they have been able to maintain this culture over the span of 500 years. Look, there was a Swedish community in Ukraine, and it died in the 1920s. They were resettled, and the Swedes were resettled to Sweden by the communists, and they were gone. And then the scientists were saying, oh, come on, the Swedish, they're so interesting, they have the language. And they stopped using that language 300 or 400 years ago. But these Greeks, they're speaking this language. It's an amazing language. Yes, this language is neither comfortable for Greece, Ukraine, or the Kremlin, but it's unique. It's a unique language. Just if you go to North Azovian, and it's like finding a dinosaur, a living dinosaur. Imagine this language still working. And living. It's unique. I mean, nowhere else you can find such a situation, and they still have that language. This is absolutely unique knowledge. It's got, they are the carriers of European wisdom and civilization. Unfortunately, the history of Mariupol Greeks shows one thing. Russia, also modern Russia, neo-totalitarian and fascist Russia, can create whatever, it can destroy whatever they please. They can destroy whatever they please. And even if we're speaking about this unique phenomenon of Mariupol Greeks, and still Russia has been consistently destroying this group for over the span of 400 years. It's just 90,000 people in this community, and they still have survived, but they may subjected to this most horrible experience. But of course, the Russians are not only after the Mariupol Greeks, they're after all of you, all of us. And the tanks have this inscription, because Mariupol has been destroyed. They say Berlin, these tanks will go against Berlin. And during the previous parade, it was saying against Mariupol. Now the tanks say to Berlin, we need to stop those tanks, at least there. It's not about the survival of Mariupol Greeks. We're talking about the survival of every one of us, also here, also in Germany.
Thank you so much. I just want to draw your attention to the work also of Olya's NGO, because they are really actively saving the languages. They published the first books, school books, where children can learn Urum and Roumean. So at the moment only Urum, but they're working on it. I finally want to open the floor for our discussion or your questions. Please feel free. I know we had a long presentation, but it was very important, and I think you all learned a lot. But please feel free to ask your questions. I see Elvis and someone else, so let's, Elvis can start here.
Дуже дякую. Мене звати Ельвіс Чолпух.
Hello, my name is Elvis Cholpuch. I represent the Assembly of Ukrainian Organizations in Europe. I would like to thank the organizers and the guests of this very important meeting. And I would like to thank you for addressing our attention to the issue of Urums and Roumeans. For me, personally, the fate of Urums and Roumeans is very important. My grandmother was born in Holzeren, in one of those regions. And if I pronounce its name Serpata, it's an Urum language. And I've heard a lot about the events in those villages. There was a Christian cemetery in that village. My grandparents were Christians, and since my childhood, I was hearing their words. They were saying it was Papi, Papizie, Fortuna, Lampat, Tuvar. All those words are from the modern Crimean language. And I understand that these words are understood to you. You, as Urums, understand what I was saying. So what I've heard hurts me a lot, and we are cognizant of this tragedy. What worries me is what is next, how to survive, how to preserve Urum and Roumean cultures because Crimea has been under occupation for 12 years. Now, this region, the northern regions, have been under the occupation for 4 years now. So we're speaking about the survival of the entire group. So what can we do here? What can every one of us do so as to help your people to survive?
I would propose that we will collect like a couple questions to save some time. Okay, so Simon.
Thanks. Буду теж поставити питання українською.
Thank you. I will also formulate my question in Ukrainian. I would like to ask what role a religion played of this nation of people, because you said that this role was very important. In what way it also was a separate character of religion, except for collectivization and great terror? And another question, you also mentioned that there were lists and there were many people who wanted to go out after these events, after the revolution, to resettle, after Bolsheviks took power. To what extent also religious elite moved out, spiritual leaders, and to what extent these people could become a target of Soviet authorities against religion. How important in the statistics was religion, because in statistics we saw it was not mentioned as a characteristics of the persecution, but maybe it was only covered by some other reasons.
Maybe one more question, if there is one.
Ірина Малишко,
I just want to say thank you. I'm also from Urums and Roumeans family. What we heard today is also history of my family. My great-grandfather was a wealthy person, and the children also was educated to become a doctor. My great-grandfather was executed by firing squad when he was 16. They fled from Yalta, and then later he took 69 years of age. He was 69. My book will be soon published about microhistory. I'm a doctor of philosophical science, and before the war I started to analyze this family question. Representative of Eastern Ukraine, typical representative, Ukrainians, Greeks, and Germans. So my book was about forestry industry in Mariupol and region. And noble inhabitants of these regions. So my book soon will be published about these areas. When I was visiting Greek villages next to Yalta, Sol, and when you go to each of these villages, you can see monuments of those who died already, and this is a historical fact that most of these people, those were men as a result of Greek and German operation, those were men. And no matter how much literature I read, I couldn't understand, was that some consequential actions, or was it a coincidence? They killed men of reproductive age mostly. And I'm really grateful for this event, because for some reason Greeks are separately and Romanians and Urums are not being told enough. And I think it is a very important subject, especially now when there is no Mariupol, when an old town is completely destroyed, when all the buildings are destroyed, that you would never be able to, even if we return Mariupol, you will never be able to get back the old town, renew it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you also for sharing. Yeah, 3 questions. First, what can we do today to preserve? Second question, religion.
Я почну щодо
Perhaps I will start
релігійної приналежності.
about religious alliance, allegiance. So being an Orthodox was an important role in identification of Greeks. Religious affiliation was important. It was one ethnical group that has two subgroups, Roumeans, that we called Hellenophones, so they speak the language, a language similar to a Greek language, and Turcophones, because they speak Turk's language. They did not preserve their language, they lost it. It was due to certain nature of the resettlement. They lived near to Crimean Tatars, and gradually their language changed. It's not Crimean Tatar language, it is a separate language, but Turkic on its basis. But they, like others, preserved Orthodox religion, Orthodox Christianity. That was a certain marker for identification. When it comes to priests, you need to understand the situation. It was quite strange, like usually it happens with Russian Empire. At the beginning, there were huge privileges and promises given with that document of the letter that was presented. But 50 years later, Russian Empire began to destroy all these rights and privileges, gradually take them away. And openly speaking, Greeks did not preserve their own Greek Orthodox unit identity. They were sent priests who didn't have their separate. So what I mean, this church belonged to Russian Orthodox Church, so they could go to churches that were not a Greek churches, but they were Russian Orthodox churches. By the way, the churches that were built in Mariupol by Greeks, resettled Greeks, were all destroyed. And none of these buildings was saved, built by Greeks. That's about that question. Now about what to do. You see, there are people who are doing that, working on the preservation. It is inspiring because we see that people gathered who do something. They publish books, and those are young people, and it is nice to see that young people are trying to preserve the memory. Of course, we as scientists, we try to help as much as we can, but our task, our function as scientists is to conduct research and to give you and tell you, like today, the history of Mariupol, North Azovian Greeks. Many things will depend, of course, from the state. Here I mean Ukraine. Ukraine should make some steps in order to preserve a nation that is a original nation in Ukraine. And I think we need to think and expect the support from different international organizations that provide support not only from Ukrainian community. It was said, Madam Larysa said, that it is a problem not only in Ukraine, but the Europe, and preservation of the nations that now suffer in Ukraine. It's not only a problem of Ukraine, because everyone will lose them. Every nation loses because other nation existed in Europe, but it ceased to exist. We all lose when original part of the civilization is disappearing. So we need all, as we live in civilized world, do whatever we can to preserve these ethnic nations. Thank you. I will say even more. There was a question about Greeks, about the name Greeks, by the way, why we have Urums and Roumeans, because these are not only Byzantines, it's a translation from Russian nomenclature. It comes from the contemporary Greek language that was a state language in Greeks' Tsardom. That's how the second Rome was called, with the capital in Constantinople. Russians called it Byzantine, and English, British. It's their historiography. But the name of that empire was Second Rome, Eastern Roman Empire. And when in 6th century the state language ceased to be Latin, that was in Western Roman Empire, and before that in Italy, antique Italy of 6th century, a state official language became in Eastern Rome was Greek language, not Hellenic. That in Hellenic polices they used to talk next to a Black Sea, but a new version of derived language became after Constantine the Great Emperor was replaced into Greek, not Latin but Greek. Since that time, emperors would not speak Latin, but the whole empire would speak Greek. The church was Greek. State was called in the sources a Greek Tsardom, and all the inhabitants, no matter what languages they would speak, no matter what was their ethnicity, they were the citizenship of this Greek kingdom. Everyone became, and here we need to focus, those who became Christian according to Eastern Roman belief. So Byzantine Orthodox, don't confuse with Russian Orthodox. Since 6th century, when ethnogenesis of autochthonic population that we now call North Azovian Greeks, that is formed in Crimea, but also formed from Alans, from tribes of Crimea, Taurids, who gave the name of Tauria, Ostgoths, who lived next to Chersones, Taurian Chersones, that was a base of Eastern Roman Empire, and from there Orthodox Christianity of Eastern Roman Church was populated. So today in North Azovian Greeks are the last carriers of the Holy Spirit and holy message that they received from a Greek kingdom, and they carried this belief, and they was called Greeks. So Urums and Roumeans are their ethnic languages, are actually called Romans. So subject of a holy king, who is a king in Constantinople, who was emperor, was under Constantinople patriarch, anointed. And when he was moved to Russia, he was the last titled metropolitan of Gothic, of Eastern Roman belief, and all Greeks were forcefully, without asking, were moved into Russian Orthodox Christianity. Their church was closed, and they were moved to Rostov church. No matter that's from the beginning, all this project, I will remind, there was no Greece.
So, in fact, there was not a state. So that project was simply to resettle the Greeks, then to create a prototype of an independent Greece in the North Azovian territories, then occupy Greece, then to make Constantine the grandson of the Tsar of Greece, and then the Peloponnese and the Balkans will become Russian. That was the idea. So the Greeks are an integral part of the Russian Orthodox Church since that time. But to destroy this church, well, in fact, the beginnings of this destruction began during the first anti-church revolution. That was 1930 and 1931. In 1938, by the end of 1938, that was by the end of the Great Terror, the last synagogue was destroyed in the Donetsk region. That is when Stalin. And so in 1938, there was no church left standing. So it's not only the Russian Greek Orthodox Church, but also Ukrainian Orthodox churches were destroyed. The Russian Orthodox churches were destroyed. So all of them were being created. Now, speaking about, yes, you mentioned, yes, the men in reproductive age. Let me repeat, and I said it once as I was presenting you with the general picture of the Great Terror. They were training. First, they trained their execution mastery when persecuting the Germans, the Poles, and the Bulgarians. But when they started persecuting the Greeks, they were already skilled. At that time, there was a special order of the NKVD published by that time. So all of those regions that my colleague mentioned, so these people were trying to save themselves. So the officers were coming and they were starting arresting people category by category. The categories were different. So one category of people was arrested and subsequently executed. Other people were arrested and were going to camps. But then the Kremlin was saying, don't send us old people. We don't want old people in the camps. Don't send us alcoholics. Don't send us the people who can't do any labor. And the Kremlin said, send us the men. Send us the men. So it was done not only against the Greeks. They were persecuting this way all other communities because those were massive arrests. That was already in November and October 1937. And if you look at the men's mortality was immense. It's simply that the Greeks were unlucky enough to be in the wrong time and in the wrong place. I know there is no consolation in it, but still, if you think of it, approximately 5,000 to 6,000 Greeks were executed. Actually, still do not know how many people were shot down, were executed in the occupied territories. And in fact, we will never find out because of what the Russians did to the archives. In fact, now we found that some of the archival documents were sold on OilLeaks webpage, starting with 2014, and they were destroying these documents. But how many Poles died? 240,000 Poles arrested, and their mortality level was not as high as in the case of the Greeks. It was 72% of Poles were executed by firing squads. But if you think of the numbers, how many people died, it's a catastrophe. And the same with the Germans. The same happened to the Germans. So look, starting with October, the locals who could not could not arrest no one else but the men. If no men were arrested, then the NKVD officers themselves were suffering. So now we know that we will not be able to rebuild the churches that have been demolished. We cannot give second life to those people who were killed and never buried. There are so many who died in 1937. But how about those residents of Mariupol who died in March 2022? How about those who died in February, March and February? These people will not be found ever. We are not capable of even finding their DNA, but still we need to amass our knowledge. We're not talking about myths, we're talking about knowledge. We need to learn more. We need to know. We need to know more, not only about the Mariupol Greeks. Of course, we need to know about Greeks because they suffered so much. They have been subjected to huge suffering. They respect our attention. And this ethnic group, from the scientific point of view, is just amazing. Not only in scientific point of view, in existential point of view, philosophical point of view, it's an amazing group. And having this knowledge, together, we will do whatever we can to survive and to help this world to survive. All of us need to survive. And by this, we will help the Mariupol Greeks to survive. They need your help. Unfortunately, Ukraine really needs anti-missile defense systems and anti-ballistic missile systems. And yes, there is a lot of criticism. We may be critical about our authorities, but we all are clear. Ukraine on its own will not be capable to protect the Mariupol Greeks. Otherwise, they disappear. We simply do not have enough power, force, and resource to do so. And yet again, they're saying they're going to bomb Kiev tomorrow. We are from Kiev, our families are in Kiev, and they have just said again that tomorrow they're going to destroy the city. Understand it. It's our joint mission. We need to survive. Do not allow Kiev to be turned into rubble. Do not allow Kiev to be turned into the second Mariupol. We need to think that Mariupol Greeks have immense value for our civilization. Materially, we cannot recreate them. But their cultural essence, their mental essence is still there. So we need to help the Urums and Roumeans to maintain the language. Those languages cannot become dead languages like Latin, but this is what the Russians are trying to do. Help the Azovian Greeks, the North Azovian Greeks, and if we act together, perhaps we will be capable of creating new reality, not a horrible reality that we are all seeing happening all around us. Thank you.
Thank you, Larysa. I think these were wonderful final words with your very strong appeal to all of us here. And this is also why Olya brought the topic to Berlin, because I think it's really the place where we also need to inform people, move people into action. So if you would agree, looking at the watch, or Anna wants to say some final words? Okay.
Я дуже коротко.
I shall be brief. Speaking about religion and what Russia does. The Russians used religion in the past so as to forcefully to resettle Christian population. As they were saying, they were saving their brothers in faith. This is what the Russians were saying. But look, what was happening, in fact, in 2014. They were doing exactly the same thing. They were kind of saving the Crimean population, as if to save them from the Bandera followers. And this Russian citizenship and all of what the Russians were doing, that's just repeating what they were doing earlier in history. What they did in 2014 and later on is just a repeat of their history. So we're here, we're thinking what to do. You may have a question. Why is it that Ukraine is fighting? We're fighting because we're historians. And we would like to help you understand, because if the Russians enter deep into Ukraine, they will go on, they move on. And in Ukraine, we will end up with yet another famine, with yet another wave of repressions, and with yet another destruction. Please help us.
So, allow me, I know that it's a very bad tone to have an event which is more as 2 hours, but I think it's very important and very deep, and thank you so much for joining us, for coming from Ukraine to Berlin to speak in details and quite important, like in oral stories, like in the voices of those who represent the history events, what is also doing Pilecki-Institute, inspired by Pilecki figure. And that's why for the closing final words, I would like to invite Director of Pilecki-Institute Berlin, Hania Radziejowska.
Thank you very much. I couldn't start and couldn't welcome you at the beginnings. I'm very sorry. So I'm very, it was absolutely incredibly interesting and harrowing. I mean, to listen to all this story, how this concrete community and minority, how was persecuted by Russia, by Soviet Union. And I felt during this evening that thank you very much for your work, that we could all listen to this story, and that you were sharing with this not only this wide perspective, but this micro history, this concrete people. And I was thinking that perhaps what here can be as a conclusion, that I felt as a Polish person, as Pole, I mean, how common history we have. I mean, how many things we can really try to explain to the Western Europe, that really it works in this way. The totalitarian systems, Russia, Soviet Union, always wanted to erase identity, erase history, erase memory. And it means that every democratic society, community is built on history and on memory. So our democratic values, our European values are built on that. And that's why it's so important to bring all these stories back to the light, and that we have to remember. It's our, like this, also the part of this, what we can do we have to support Ukraine and whatever is needed to do, and what we can do to give Ukraine everything what they need to win, because victory is the most important. It's not the other option. And this is the story which is behind. Yes, you were telling about that. It's no other option. And but it's also to remember and to share to learn this history. Yes, to remember about these people. So thank you very much for this evening, and yes, and thank you, Eva, and thank you to all organizations that were WICE, Ukrainisches Institut, Gesellschaft für bedrohte Völker, and all, and I'm sorry, the most important, the co-organizer, which prepared this beautiful and very interesting pop-up exhibition. Thank you very much. And yes, and that's perhaps without puenta.
Yes, so, and thank you so much for North Azovian Greeks NGO, and Oля, to you, to your team. And the pop-up exhibition can be seen till the 12th of June. You see, they know better. So that's the sign to come back and to get it better as I remembered.